Welcome to the AI Policy Podcast, a podcast by the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at CSIS. I'm Gregory C. Allen.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz.
Join us as we dive into the world of AI policy, where we'll discuss the implications of this transformative technology for national security, geopolitics, and global governance. Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. I'm your host, Gregory C. Allen, the director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today, we are privileged to bring back to CSIS a friend of the institution, Dragoș Tudorache, who until very recently was a member of the European Parliament, where, among other duties, he co-led negotiations on the European Union's AI Act as co-rapporteur of the EU Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs, and also served as the chair of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age. He also has a fascinating career history, including as head of the unit for the Directorate General of Migration and Home Affairs for the European Commission, and also a judge and interior minister in his home country, home government of Romania. If you want to hear about his fascinating life story, I highly encourage you to look at the interview that we did with Dragoș back in, I want to say, September of 2022, where he really sort of told his journey of how he came to be one of the really foremost leaders of European Union AI policy. So, Dragoș, thank you so much for coming to the AI Policy Podcast.
You're very welcome, Greg. It's great to realize that it's been 2 years since my this is my last confession here at CSS.
Exactly. So we are catching you at a moment where you are no longer part of the European Parliament. And not that you were ever shy about speaking your mind before, but I feel like we're fortunate to sort of catch you in this moment where you can say whatever you want and not have to be subject to an election, sometime in the not too distant future. So, of course, we're here to talk about AI policy, and what you are famous in Washington and in Brussels and in capitals around the world as is for your leadership on the EU AI Act, which is really the first comprehensive horizontal AI regulation policy in the world. So walk us through this journey. You've been a part of the AI policy in the EU Parliament and also a little bit of the Commission for more than 3-4 years now at this stage. So where would you say we are in the story? Parts of the EU AI Act are in force, but not other parts. Where do you sort of see us being right now?
Well, we are at this very interesting juncture where now the legislation is a fact of life. So it's been adopted, it's done and dusted, and now we have to move on to implementing it, which is, I think, going to be the much harder part of the journey of the story.
Not that your negotiations were particularly easy.
Were particularly easy,
yeah.
And that was not fascinating and difficult in itself. But certainly because there is no blueprint, because there is no precedent of how do you implement, what kind of tools do you need to develop to measure up AI applications, this is the part that starts now.
Yeah.
There's a, let's call it, transition period of about 2 years from the moment when the legislation came into force, which is already now a month and a half ago, to the moment when all of its provisions are going to be enforceable. So this part is also quite interesting because it's a phased approach. So certain parts of the text are going to go live in pretty much 6 months' time by May of next year.
That's the high risk
That's
systems?
not the high risk. It's actually the part that relates to the
general purpose AI
the
systems
general purpose
provision.
AI
Yes.
system, exactly, the top tier.
Yep. So this is
the,
like large language models.
The large language models, the big generative AI tools.
Mm-hmm.
And for that purpose, there's now a process that just started with the preparation of a code of practice, which is the basis for the implementation, because we realized already during the negotiations that, okay, you put some obligations in place for these players, but you have to know how will they be implementing them. And again, because, as I said, there is no blueprint and there are no established tools and methodologies, we realized that there's a process where we have to work with the companies themselves, in fact, and also with other stakeholders, academia, civil society, to be able to arrive to a reasonable set of methodologies and tools that would be then used for enforcement.
Yeah.
And that's where we are right now. And then there are other parts of the text which are going to go live in about 2 years.
So let's dive into that part around the codes of practice. What I've sort of been telling folks is that the EU AI Act is, on the one hand, a very substantive piece of legislation and also kind of a promise to actually finish the job at a later date, which is what you're getting at with this sort of very difficult path towards implementation. So, some folks say that the EU AI Act is an incredibly strict regulation. Some say, they didn't go far enough. And I often say, actually, that question is not yet answered because this code of practice, as you say, for the general purpose AI models, the large language models, there's some things that have to be done that are spelled out in the legislation, but a lot is just sort of like thou shalt follow the code of practice. And that code of practice is sort of being developed now in real time, of course, in the European Commission in consultation with the leading companies, sort of what is the state of the art of AI safety? What is the state of the art in risk mitigation? What is the state of the art in protecting, consumers of AI systems? But that's really hard work. It's work that's going on right now, as I understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not only about the code of practice, because in fact, if one takes a look at other parts of the AI Act, you will see that there's quite a lot of flexibility built into it. And we've done that with purpose because we realize that for many of these elements, there is no history. Companies themselves, forces themselves won't know exactly what it is and how it is that they're going to measure up, judge whether a particular application will be high risk or not. So in other parts of the text, there is a provision and a mandate given to the Commission for further guidelines to be worked on, adopted, and therefore ready for implementation in 2 years' time when, for example, the high-risk applications will kick in. So all of this process is a process where we're doing something new, because you said it yourself, EU legislation tends to be rather rigid, very fixed in terms of the obligations and rights that it creates, whereas this one, again, because we realize it's a nascent technology, it's very fluid, there are a lot of things that we don't understand right now. That's why the AI office also has a scientific panel attached to it, because there's a lot of learning that we know the AI office will have to do itself. So this 2-year period is meant to achieve exactly that, to work together with all those that can bring an input into the process, to learn what is the best practice, the state of the art out there, at the very moment when all of those things will have to be put into motion, and then have the right tools in place to do the enforcement.
So I want to come back to this point you made about the sort of flexibility built into the legislation, because I was talking about the code of practice and sort of erroneously represented it as a one and done thing. But I remember in our conversations in Brussels, you talked about really structuring that flexibility in. So for folks in the audience who are principally Americans and are familiar with the difference between administrative law, which executive branches have some flexibility to, alter the regulatory standards in order to execute a legislative direction, although this changed recently with the Chevron rule somewhat. But that's a sort of a distinction that most folks, I think, know who are listening to this podcast. But what exactly did you do that was different in the EU AI Act that actually, gave the Commission this flexibility in implementing the regulations and changing it over time?
Well, it was a challenge that we realized we're going to have at the very start when we worked on this text. Because we realized, again, with this technology being constantly in motion, and a lot of it will be learning by doing.
Yeah, I mean, just one example that I think is so salient. When the European Commission started working on, do we want to have an AI Act? Most people were not thinking about large language models. Most people were not thinking about generative AI. And then that, really hits its wave in November of 2022, and you're looking at the EU AI Act and be like, okay, we need to think about, what needs to change, what needs not to change. And I think one of the most strongest arguments is, okay, we have to build in flexibility.
Absolutely.
This technology is not going to stop changing.
That's a perfect example also in terms of how do you qualify and what do you qualify as high risk. That was a snapshot that we took at the moment when we wrote the text. But we realized that, listen, there are many new applications that are going to be appearing out there, and maybe they will be high risk. We don't know yet. So there needs to be flexibility to be able to add, or maybe, who knows, subtract, because you'd realize that certain things that you thought would be bringing about risks, maybe they aren't. So again, we made use of a tool that we have in the EU legal system, where you can amend a piece of legislation where the legislators have fixed certain elements in stone in the law itself, but you realize that certain technical parts, those that are, let's say, technologically neutral, where you may need to do adaptations because technically the object of your regulation is moving. And again, in the EU legal system, we have something that is called comitology, where you give a mandate to the European Commission as the executive branch of the EU to bring these technical adaptations to the text to make sure that the text stays alive. So we've made use of this trick, and in all of those parts of the text where we realize that this flexibility is necessary, we've given this mandate to the Commission, and we said, listen, here, Commission, you have a mandate to intervene when you would have, and then we also designed in the governance a consultative process where with everyone around the table, not only companies developing AI, but also those that would be at the other end of the stick in terms
consumers of AI?
Consumer associations, academia, civil society. So all those that would have a contribution to bring in the conversation to say, listen, it is time to change. It is time to adapt. And then again, the Commission, based on these processes, then can take the necessary steps and adopt what is called an implementing act, where they amend those annexes with the list of high risks, or they bring in guidelines which say how do you need to interpret to be able to self-assess yourself as a company to see whether you are in a high-risk category or not. So again, all of those things where that flexibility we thought was absolutely necessary for this regulation to stay relevant for what its intended purpose is.
Yeah, so I love that you've built in this flexibility to sort of adapt flexibly to the nature of AI technology and how it's being used, and also what the risk landscape is. So now I want to sort of ask you to deal with some of the public criticisms of the EU AI Act and whether this flexibility is sort of adequate to address the problem. So there have been some public figures, including some associated with the European Union, who have expressed concerns about the AI Act and whether or not it's set the regulatory bar too high, whether or not it is discouraging innovation from taking place in the European Union. You know, we noted, of course, that Mario Draghi, who recently put out that report on competitiveness in the European Union, that report included a quote that the EU largely missed out on the digital revolution led by the internet and now faces an existential challenge in technology competitiveness. So that part of the story, you know, what would you say to the folks who say, you know, now is not the right time to regulate AI and you are putting the EU in a precarious position when the internet story was already not an especially happy one?
Well, first of all, we're not regulating all of the AI. I think that's a very important thing to understand.
Yeah.
People think that what we've done with the AI Act is to take all of the AI out there and bring it under one umbrella and say, listen, there are very rigorous rules that now apply to all of you. It's not the case. In fact, in the assessment of the Commission, whether we take it for face value or not, but I think it's a right analysis to say that only somewhere between 10 and 15% of all the AI out there is going to actually be covered by the regulation.
Got it. So like one of the first actions of the EU is to define this is what we think of as AI, and then by the way, all this part of AI we're not interested in regulating.
It's regulation free.
Yeah. Okay.
So in fact, we hope that all of the innovation in all those other areas of AI that are not going to be under the scope of the AI Act, are going to, that innovation is going to be there. And of course, we need all the other instruments in place to make sure that innovation happens in Europe. And again, it's not only the regulation that is part of that mix, but we can maybe get to that part of the conversation later. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that even if you happen to be in that developing AI in one of those areas, which is covered by the regulation, we have done things that we did not do with previous pieces of regulation, including on digital, for example, GDPR, which is we've moved from a world where you would need to invest quite a lot of money in compliance to a system where if you are particularly a smaller company, a small innovator, an SME that wants to break it out there in the market, you can do so with limited cost. And how you do that? First of all, you can self-assess. You don't need to go and spend money with a big.
You're not hiring some third-party compliance.
Exactly. You don't need to chase a bunch of lawyers to be able to then tell you whether you're compliant or not. You will have standards. You'll have guidelines, as I said earlier, provided by the Commission in this time period before the regulation actually kicks in. And during that time, you'll get the necessary clarity in technical terms to be able, even with a small team of engineers that you might have in your small company, to realize whether you are falling in one category of risk or another.
So an actual EU government official will sort of come out to your company at your request and advise you? Is that what?
No, that's a second process that is also available. The first part is that you are self-assessing.
You're just self-assessing. Okay.
So again, you're in a garage with your three buddies developing a cool AI. Well, you look at the technical standards, you look at the technical guidelines. You don't need to understand the lawyerish to be able to figure it out, because you're going to have these aids, these technical aids that will help you to do that self-assessment.
And I think you could also argue, right, if you're in that 10 to 15% that is regulated, these are, you know, questions that your customers are also going to be asking of you, right? It's
Absolutely.
not just the regulations.
Absolutely. But let's say that even after that process, you are uncertain. You want to go to the market, but what if I miss? What if I'm judging myself too harshly, or what if I'm underestimating the impact of my AI? Then you have the possibility to go and knock on the door of a sandbox. If we've introduced this sort of institutionalized system of sandboxes throughout the union in every member states, we actually want to push them down to the municipal level, so as many as possible. Why? Because that is the process where you said earlier, you will have a representative of the authority, of the public authority at the national level in charge of implementing the AI Act, who, together with you, in that sandbox, which is a place for trial and error, if you want, you can actually make mistakes. You can actually ask stupid questions. You can actually validate your assumptions in developing that app, that AI, and say, listen, am I judging myself rightly or not? Am I in this category or risk? Am I actually covered at all by the legislation or not?
So just to make sure I understand you correctly, the first thing is for the small companies, they can just self-assess. They are not required to hire some kind of third-party compliance auditor.
Right.
And then if they feel like they still face regulatory risk or
They go to a
regulatory
sandbox,
uncertainty,
they do their testing, they do their one-on-one with the...
And is that like a safe harbor of liability
Yes.
sort of clause?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
That's great. So that's really attractive to the small guys. What about the argument that this is still, too much of a regulatory burden? Still, I'm thinking about, for example, Meta and OpenAI have sort of very loudly and publicly, I think they're pretty clearly trying to send a signal, right? Sort of delayed introduction of some of their features into the EU. They're saying it's because they're sort of unclear about this regulatory risk, but they're also, I think it's fair to say, trying to send some kind of message about their displeasure with the regulatory ecosystem. So we've talked about the small guys. What about the big guys?
Well, first of all, the big guys, I'm not concerned about the costs for compliance because I think they can afford it.
They can afford it,
aside.
Right.
I put that aside. I think it is to be expected in an industry that has not had regulation almost at all for the last 20, 30 years. Whenever you come first, of course, you're going to annoy them. But it was the same 80, 90 years ago with the pharmaceutical companies, I guess. It was the same with electricity. It was the same with oil and gas. It was the same with every other industry that had their pioneering age at the very start for various periods of time. And then there was a moment when we thought, well, these things actually raise safety concerns. These things are impacting society in a way that we as public authority have a duty towards our citizens to be able to control somehow. And then did that stop innovation? Is the big pharmaceutical industry not innovating? Although they have quite a hefty amount of regulation, both in Europe and here in the US and everywhere else around the world. No, they're still innovating. The same thing goes for every other industry out there. I think what these companies will have to learn is that it is, in fact, common sense, and it is what their duty towards society is right now that this industry matured. And this industry has started to show not only its beautiful benefits and great facilitation that it brings to our lives, but also some risks.
So I think the argument you've made is a compelling one, right? About how industries, as they take on functions in society, in the economy, that are safety critical, that are loss of human life, at risk, or significant risk to the economy, or what have you, regulation gets involved. The government gets involved to protect the rights and interests of the diverse stakeholders across society. I think there are some who would argue that, for AI, that moment may come, but perhaps it is too soon at this moment. And I think you're right when you point out that when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, they are still competitive. But one thing that might be different in this case is a disparity in regulatory intensity across different jurisdictions. So in a scenario where, let's just say the EU has perfectly calibrated, the right trade-offs of safety, privacy, public interest, and innovation. Like they literally hit a bullseye. But then you have a freewheeling US or a freewheeling China, or, in some conversations we've been having recently around CSIS, a freewheeling Middle East. Companies like G42 are actually, most of their critical talent is European and has left Europe to go work in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or what have you. And so I'm curious about how you think regulatory optimization intersects with the issue of international competitiveness.
It's a very fair argument, and ideally, in an ideal world, you would be able to move across jurisdictions with these regulatory steps at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, some stuff like GDPR really did end up going global, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's a very good example because, again, we were the first to do GDPR. Many asked, is it necessary? Why would you do that? And then they ended up several years later figuring out that actually privacy is a thing that also concerns their citizens, their societies, and they had to do something about it.
Here's one moment where I have to really just give you kudos for folks who are not aware. So you've said, there's no precedent for AI regulation, but one of the things I have to commend you on here is you've been a critic of GDPR at various times, especially on the sort of implementation of it and how it was a very fragmented approach. So, what I do want to commend you for is that as you're designing the EU AI Act, you have been conscious of areas where the EU did not get it perfectly right the first time and really try to do more and do better on this EU AI Act, which I really appreciate. And I think people don't necessarily know that, because people will hate on GDPR and say that AI Act is actually GDPR all over again. But you, Dragoș Tudorache, one of the principal authors of the EU AI Act, have also been a critic of GDPR in the past and are very conscious of those criticisms and which of them have merit.
No, it's true. We've tried to learn as much as we could from actually what worked less well with GDPR, and not only with GDPR, because we have to admit that we did, in a way, not necessarily hit the target with some of the regulatory approaches.
Yeah, it's not that privacy wasn't worth defending. It's
exactly.
just that implementation matters, right? Yeah.
And again, also there was a lot of pioneering involved, and you have to accept that when you do pioneering, sometimes you get it wrong.
Yep.
But I thought it was absolutely fundamental for us to learn from those, let's say, mistakes or those for the things that work less well in implementing the GDPR and actually do it differently with the AI Act.
Okay, so now I'm going to go the entire opposite route, right? So I've been asking you to react to some of the criticisms that the regulations are too intense and they're going to hamper innovation. There's this entire other community of criticisms who are saying that the regulations are what big tech wants, because they can pay the compliance costs, and that this is actually, a trick for Microsoft or Google or whoever to sort of entrench their dominance for all time. So I realize it literally exactly contradicts the other arguments I was asking you to respond to, but I want to get your insights on this issue. So what would you say to those folks?
Well, I'll bring in an anecdote. In the very first meeting that I had with the shadow rapporteurs are the representatives of the other political groups in the European Parliament that we sit together basically in working legislation, and it's the rapporteur that leads that process. And in the very first meeting, looking at the gargantuan task that we had ahead of us working this text, I told them one thing. I said, listen, I think the success, if we are to have success in this process, I think the measure of success is if we are leaving this room equally unhappy. Why I say this is because for me, the fact that you have different constituencies, different stakeholders who, in a way, express criticism on looking at it from different perspectives, I think it also shows that there is a balance in the text. It was impossible with a text like this one to make everybody happy.
Yeah.
That would have been either utopic or then such a low denominator that would have been just basically holy water.
Yeah, you're just
really
passing
not
a
making
resolution.
Any impact exactly on actually what you wanted to do. The fact that, again, you managed to introduce what you wanted to introduce in terms of impact, in terms of obligations, in terms of rights. You've created certain uneasiness in certain constituencies and then in others, but overall there is an equilibrium, and I think that balance is there. I think for me that is a measure of a good compromise, which is what EU legislation always is, a compromise between different views, different positions, but one that actually shows what actually is workable, what is achievable, where is that sweet spot of balance between the different interests at play.
So now I want to talk about, what this implementation is going to look like. I think one of the most noteworthy things, we were just talking about how this is different from GDPR, is some of the centralized capacity that is going to exist inside the European Commission to implement, enforce, adjudicate this act at the EU-wide level. So for folks who are not familiar with GDPR, one of the weird things that could happen is that because interpretation of the law and enforcement of the law was a national level jurisdiction issue, you could get something where, Germany and Ireland are both quote unquote implementing GDPR, but you might have very different, reality of what that implementation looks like. So for the EU AI Act, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you've got the AI Office, this new institution that is being created as part of the European European Commission and DG Connect. Talk to us about where we are in the story of setting up the AI Office, because this is something you personally fought for really hard in the negotiations in the Parliament.
No, true. And it was part of that learning process that I mentioned earlier about GDPR. And we realized that we need a very strong governance at central level, at EU level, to make sure that on one hand that you manage to have that uniformity of implementation, interpretation, application of the law, but also to have the necessary punch and a coherent punch when it comes to interacting with particularly the bigger players on the market. And this is what, as I said earlier, what's going to happen in 6 to 9 months' time.
Yeah, I think just to harp on that, you talked about being able to punch, right, at equal weight with the folks you're regulating. What happens sometimes in really technically intense fields is that the government is just not qualified to engage in the conversation with the industry. Sometimes you do need to be able to dive into the nitty-gritty in order to design a regulation, enforce a regulation. For example, if you want to have nuclear safety regulations, the government had better have some very good nuclear safety engineers on its payroll. So in the case of the AI Office,
that's where we are right now.
You're trying to attract, really serious technical talent. There's been some cases where that's been true. If you look at the UK AI Safety Institute or the US AI Safety Institute, very notably, some researchers, some leading developers of AI have left, 8-figure salaries to go make a pretty lousy government salary, at least by comparison, and work on AI safety issues or AI governance issues. So how's it going at the AI Office? How big is it going to be? How much of that is going to be technical experts? And where are you in the story right now?
To start with, the AI Office is supposed to have somewhere around 100 plus.
100 plus, wow.
100 plus staff. They are in the second or third by now round of recruitments. And that's precisely what they are looking for, the kind of technical specialists, those that are able, those nuclear engineers, those that are able to then participate in the preparation of the code of practice, interact with the companies that are going to be the subjects of the law. In other words, do what normally the Commission would not have the talent, the expertise to do as a public body. The recruitment is ongoing. As far as I understand, there's actually quite a lot of enthusiasm. As you said yourself, from the experience of the UK Safety Institute and the US Safety Institute, surprisingly, there's quite a number of people who are ready to leave the private sector behind and actually come and join a good, noble public cause. And that's actually quite encouraging. So that's an ongoing process. The idea is that by the time the office will have to take in its first challenge, and that again is going to be in spring of next year, which is to deal with the large language models that are part of the top tier, that the office will be strong enough, competitive enough, with the right expertise as part of its ranks to be able to, again, do the red teaming, get access to look under the hood of these systems, understand what's in there, and then do their jobs.
Okay, so the EU AI Office, at least in its public-facing communications, has talked about having 5 different units. Those are regulation and compliance, AI safety, excellence in AI and robotics, AI for societal good, and AI innovation and policy coordination. So 5 units, 5 functions. Almost everybody is talking about the regulation and compliance function, but you've got this whole other thing that these 100 people are supposed to do. So recognizing that you do not currently work for the AI Safety Office, but you were very involved in the negotiations that there should be one and what it should look like, talk to us about what these different functions are going to perform and how that's going to work.
Well, this office also has this regulatory function as well. We mentioned earlier guidelines, code of practices, implementing acts that will be adapting and adopt the regulation as the technology moves along. So evidently the office also has to have this sort of regulatory capability, i.e. continue to work, understand the evolution of the technology, adapt, propose those adaptations for the legislators. So that's why you have a unit that deals with regulatory compliance. Then safety. Again, this office will have to deal with the AI developers themselves directly to be able to assess compliance and also do the enforcement bit if necessary.
So on the
That
US...
is why safety is necessary as well, which is what the safety institutes, for example, in the US or the UK do. These are, if you want, the safety unit inside the AI office is the safety institute in the UK or the safety institute here in the US.
So I just want to, because I'm very interested in the different functions that the safety institutes play. So, Elizabeth Kelly, who's the director of the U.S. AI Safety Institute, came by and was on this same podcast not that long ago. And she really defines the mission as advancing the science of AI safety, really actually conducting research to advance the state of the art in AI safety, and then also evaluating what's going on in industry, what are the best practices, and translating that into formal guidance, which in the case of the AI Safety Institute seems pretty unlikely, at least near term, to be tied to mandatory regulatory compliance. But, theoretically, who knows what the future holds for Congress or the White House or what have you. So maybe in the future it could be tied explicitly to regulatory compliance. Is the AI Safety Office going to be conducting research? Are they going to be writing voluntary guidelines? Are they going to be writing mandatory guidelines? Are they going to be conducting red teaming audits? How is all this going to work from a machinery perspective?
They're going to do all of that plus more.
No kidding. Okay. What's the more?
Well, the more comes from the fact that we don't have just a loose framework of voluntary commitments like you have for the time being in the US under the executive order, which is what the Safety Institute is in fact implementing.
Yeah, I mean, to their credit, and I just have to defend my country here a little bit, right? It is voluntary, but all the big tech companies have signed up. So they have gone to the AI Safety Institute and they've said, even though we don't have to, we do want you to run our models through the ringer. See if you can find out ways that they're not safe, that our own internal folks didn't find out. So it is voluntary, but I would say it's not irrelevant.
True. No, absolutely. And far from me to say that. But what the office has extra, that's where the plus comes in, it actually has a very clear set of rules, of obligations in the AI Act, which will say, well, if you do not give me the right access, if you do not do what you're supposed to do in terms of mitigating the risks, in terms of showing me the documentation, in terms of doing the copyright detailed summary. So if you don't do those things, it's not only that you have not lived up to your voluntary commitment, which you signed up on, but you're going to have to show me the money.
Yeah, you're gonna be dealing with a hefty fine.
Or leave my market.
Right.
So the office has that extra enforcement element to it and to its work, apart from the research, apart from again furthering the knowledge, apart from, you mentioned earlier, there will be units that also will be doing the excellence in AI, because it's also something that we realize from the very start that we'll have to balance out everything that the office will be doing in terms of enforcing the law with the part that it remains critical for the EU, which is encouraging innovation, putting the right tools up there for those that want to innovate, such as the network of supercomputers that the EU has invested quite a lot of money in, which will be put at the disposal of AI creators out there. So again, the office will be doing all of that, innovation, research, but also enforcement when the time will come and if it's going to be necessary.
I love your answer. I want to come back to this point about innovation and promoting innovation here in a moment. But before we do that, one thing that really strikes me is the argument for cooperation between the United States, the European Union, and other like-minded countries on this story. And as we're talking about this, when you think about, and right for this moment, we're talking about the most advanced models, large language models, general purpose AI systems, et cetera. But I think this argument kind of applies more broadly. So you've got a U.S. system where most of the guidance and governance is going to be on a voluntary basis, but in partnership with the government. And then you've got the EU, where some of it, at least, is going to be on the mandatory basis. But the companies are doing it in both places, right? Even in the US where it's voluntary. And this is where I think there's a strong argument for collaboration on the part of the US government and the European Union government is because we are both going to be developing guidance for what effective red teaming looks like. We are both going to be developing guidance for what an internal system of inventorying models, inventorying model use cases, making sure that models are used for uses that are approved and making sure that they are not used for uses where they are not approved. Guidance is coming for all of that stuff, and it's coming in both jurisdictions, whether it's voluntary or whether it's mandatory. And I think not only is there, a real opportunity sort of just to exchange knowledge and best practices, but you can really, if you do effectively collaborate, you can reduce the barriers to trade, you can reduce the barriers to shared cooperative research, and you can ensure that, even though we might disagree on some parts of this, we're still friends, we're still very deep partners, and we still want to work together on this all the time.
Listen, I've been a strong advocate of that from day one when I started working as the chair of the special committee on AI.
I have to say, for the audience, Dragos was recently a politician, and of course he's very good at pointing out what he's accomplished while he was in office. But I just want everybody in the audience to know this is factually true. Dragos really stands out among all members of the European Parliament who came repeatedly to Washington, who met with the AI governance community, really even before there was one. I mean, I remember, you came and you sort of said, who are my counterparts on Capitol Hill? It doesn't seem like there's anybody really paying attention to this. So you really stand out as somebody who's been committed to interoperability and collaboration before it was cool, I might say.
No, true. I remember, I think the first break that we got in COVID, in between the variants, back in 2020, and I wanted to take my committee on a trip during that break. And that first trip that we took was here to Washington. And we had to look for interlocutors, and we found the AI caucus in Congress, and we met with the AI caucus. And that's how we started to develop a partnership, I would dare say, and even friendship with many of the members in Congress.
Yeah, and I've heard wonderful things about you from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah. And I think that we have to continue to invest in that, not only politically, but also as these organisms are starting to shape up, even if they have maybe different mandates. The Safety Institute here in Washington, the Safety Institute in London, there's a Safety Institute in Japan,
South Korea,
there's going to be one in Canada,
yeah.
And the European Union office. These institutes, these offices will have to work together.
Yeah.
Because as you rightly say, you cannot have different guidelines, you cannot have different standards. It's the same companies, it's the same AI everywhere. It would be foolish to actually allow them to start growing in different directions, rules and standards. And also in terms of the tools that you will need to implement and to measure up that AI, again, it makes sense that you develop and you think of those and you do the research even together. So I'll continue to advocate for that as much and as loudly as I can, because I think it's the right path. And then if somehow in the months or years to come, also the regulatory approaches will start converging, they'll never be the same.
Yeah.
But they can have or reach some sort of functional equivalence at some sort. And I looked just coming here, I looked out of curiosity to see what's happening in Congress, what has been happening in Congress for the last 6 months. And actually I have to say, there's been quite a mushrooming of proposals out there. I have 3 pages of entries with legislation that has been proposed only in the last, I think, 6 to 9 months in Congress.
And that's just a list of bills.
The list of bills.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. I looked at the content of each of these bills. If I were to sum them up, you would actually have the AI Act.
Mm.
If you were to
take all 3 pages of bills,
you take the 3 pages of bills, the topics of each of them.
Yeah.
You've
got deep fakes, you've got non-consensual.
You've got everything.
Yeah.
You've got law enforcement. You've got everything that we have in the AI Act, you have it there. Maybe not all of them will pass. Mm-hmm. Certainly they will not all be put together in one single bill. Also because the political tradition here is different.
Yeah.
The legal tradition is different.
The committee assignments are different.
Exactly.
Yada, yada, yada. Yeah.
But again, it's the functional equivalence that I mentioned earlier that will matter. And maybe it's going to take another year or maybe 2 years, but I am convinced there will be legislation on AI coming out of Congress.
So now I want to take us back to a topic that we tabled a moment ago, which is that the EU AI office has this dual mandate, right? It's involved in the regulation and compliance, it's involved in the safety, but it's also got these boxes on an org chart called Excellence in AI Robotics, AI for Societal Good, and AI Innovation and Policy Coordination. So what are these other, I'm calling them boxes on an org chart, but what are these other parts of the office going to be doing? And, is this a investment activity? Are you actually going to be promoting industry, or how's this all going to work?
It's very much the office wanting to remain open to what is actually happening in the AI world. So that's the part where it needs to outreach, it needs to understand, it needs to research, it needs to connect with the reality on the ground. At the same time, it also wants to be, and the EU, because we are quite, I think, reasonably and understandably concerned about the competitiveness of the EU, and you want to stay relevant in the race.
Yep.
And we realize that you need investment. You need encouragement. You need to create the right ecosystems for the companies that so far maybe have not been that successful or that energetic in actually putting good business models out there to actually do so. And we look at what are the main drivers. What do you need? You need compute. You need energy. You need things that some companies may be able to get themselves, but others, particularly the smaller ones, will have difficulties in being able to access. So that is what the office is supposed to do. It's supposed to connect with this reality in the EU economy. It's supposed to create these ecosystems or help create the ecosystems. I mentioned earlier the network of supercomputers that the EU has invested on. There are also supercomputers that have been bought or developed nationally in the member states. All these need to be linked up. Again, if the EU economy, if the EU single market is to actually act as a single market, also in terms of AI innovation and development.
So the supercomputer network is no joke. Real companies that are real leaders in AI do take advantage of these supercomputers. But I also want to point out that what is on the horizon for AI training is just jaw-dropping. This prediction might not come true, but Goldman Sachs put out an estimate that data centers in the United States are currently something like 2 to 3% of all the electricity in the United States. And there's a plausible path in the next 10, 15 years where 15% of all the electricity in the country could be used for data centers to run AI stuff. So that isn't just a jaw-dropping degree of capital investment required. It also touches on some environmental issues. Most of these big AI companies have renewable energy targets, but it's really hard, to go to 15% of your entire electrical grid being AI data centers and keep those targets, especially in the time frames that we're thinking about. So this was not a hot topic 4 years ago, but it is a white hot topic in Washington, D.C. right now. I'm curious, the EU AI Act really doesn't have big energy provisions, but you've got this AI office that is sort of thinking about these types of topics. So what's your take on it and how it intersects with the EU's goals?
Well, certainly these are the main elements of what it means when we say AI is geopolitical. Because again, if you look at what actually are the needs of the AI of tomorrow, you bump into the same things. You bump into compute and the access to, again, the ability to compute at enormous jaw-dropping levels. You have energy, you have data. And EU, if it wants to, again, be in this race, needs to be able to produce all that or give access to all that to the European companies that will want to remain competitive or be competitive or take on the big giants existing out there. And the capabilities of investment are also not equal. If you look at some of the amounts of the billions that are being put by some of these companies alone right now, and that they are forecasted for the coming years, there is no European company right now that on its own can actually do that.
Yeah.
So the EU needs to muster up all of its resources, all of its might, public and private, to be able to, again, live up to that need. The energy consumption and the energy element to it is something that everyone is now waking up to.
Yeah.
It's a conversation that we didn't have 2 years ago.
Yep.
Some people were saying, listen, you'll have to look into that as well. It's not something that you can ignore. Now it's becoming a reality that people are seeing needs to be catered for. By 2026, basically, you have the equivalent of a country like Finland or Austria in terms of energy consumption. Absolutely. And that requires public investment. It's not only by private investment, and I think it's relevant also for here in the US. You're not going to do upgrades to the grid only by private investment alone. So there need to be a joint venture between public capital and private capital to be able to develop that ecosystem that allows an economy such as the US economy or the EU economy to live up to the needs of AI development. But that's also a question as to whether AI is going to develop in a linear fashion based on what we know today. So many are just looking at how the capabilities of large language models, because we're mainly talking about the large language models, which are so energy hungry and so data hungry. And they look in a linear fashion to just adding more compute and adding more energy and adding more data to be able to then achieve a growth of capability of whatever, 5 times more, 10 times more, 100 times more. I think there's one element that is not factored in, I think sufficiently in my view, which is the fact that you will also have to factor in the possibility of leaps in the actual architecture, in the actual conceptual structure of the algorithms and of way AI works.
Because I mean, we've had multiple stages of algorithmic revolution, right? Whether that's going from early neural networks to deep learning in like 2006, whether that's going from regular deep learning to deep learning with GPUs in 2012,
and
then
we're
more
still
recently,
there.
Well, no, because now we have transformers too, which I would argue is yet another massive architectural revolution. So, there's people out there who are saying, "Oh my gosh, why are we so excited about the future of AI? Clearly transformers are going to hit this plateau of performance." And I'm saying, "Look, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. But even if transformers do hit some kind of plateau, upon what basis, looking at the past performance of the 2 decades, would you say AI as a field is going to plateau?" These people bust through algorithmic walls pretty routinely. And a lot of the smartest people in the world are working on this.
And I would dare say it needs to happen, because I think the linear growth is not sustainable. We would not be able
it's really
to
exponential
just
growth, right?
mathematically add just more GPUs and more energy and just.
Well, if you're Jensen Huang, he would strongly disagree. You could definitely buy more GPUs.
No, buy them up to a point, but again, it's going to become unsustainable.
Yeah. So the AI office's role in this, because I do think that's important for folks to know that it does have this role related to innovation. It's not just a regulatory and compliance shop. Obviously, they're not in charge of, building the grid or regulating the grid or anything like that. But are they going to be like generating proposals? Are they going to be running analysis that might support the kind of industrial policy or innovation policy that the broader EU might want to consider? Or what would be their role in that story?
Well, a lot of it is going to be learning by doing. So I think the starting point is what I mentioned earlier, already the capabilities that have been invested on already at EU level, the supercomputers, the AI factories, as the Commission likes to call them. But at the same time is to coordinate the member states' efforts. Because what happens right now is that we have a bit of an uneven reality in different member states. There are member states who have understood quite early on that AI is a very important bet for their economies. And I have invested nationally quite a lot in AI, both in terms of public capabilities, public investment, but also creating the right ecosystems and conditions for growth.
France?
I'm thinking like France, Spain, Germany, but not only. Many out there as well.
Sweden.
And the idea of this part of the AI office is also to understand what is the reality in the different member states, and then link up all of those efforts and try and maybe coordinate is too strong of a word, but at least create the conditions where all of these national realities are more and more part of a common reality, which represents the.
All right, so now I'm going to ask you to weigh in on something deeply political. So when you think about coordinating investments, as you were just saying, I'm oversimplifying here, but there's kind of 2 models, right? One would be the way the European Space Agency does it. which is every country, the amount of money that they put in is the amount of money that their industry can expect to be on contract for coming out of the process. So if Germany puts in 10% of the European Space Agency's budget, you can bet that 10% of the contracts from the European Space Agency are going to go to German companies, right? And that's politically convenient, but it's not industrially convenient. It's not operationally convenient. And then the flip side you have is what I believe Emmanuel Macron of France is arguing for, which is that you need a willingness on the part of the EU to recognize that there are going to be important economies of scale here, and that if we just spread the money around too much, and give every EU member state, some degree of subsidy, what we're going to wind up with is a not especially internationally competitive industry. And I think, Macron is basically saying, give a lot of money to France. Between the lines, that's sort of what I would say. But I also do think he has a little bit of an argument right here about how there are economies of scale here. There is, a need to sort of pick winners because, in the United States, California is a big part of the story of the US AI ecosystem. It's not all of the story, but it's a very big part of the story. And so the idea that, EU would also have real hubs, but of course it runs into this political difficulties. What's your take on what the EU should do there?
Well, I tend to lean towards the second recipe more than the first, or maybe a hybrid between the first and the second. I do think it's important to try and hold the member states, each of them by the hand, and try to encourage them to also do things and give them a bit their share of what they need to be able to develop themselves. And the Commission has done so quite a lot with investing in hubs in all of the member states, digital hubs. It put important EU money in there, also trying to act as instigators for national investments in the area of digital around those hubs, which the Commission funded. Now it's time to try and see if we can reap some benefits of that, particularly in terms of AI. And many of these hubs, the Commission is trying to redirect towards AI, for example, in most of the member states. But clearly, competitiveness is not something that we can actually plan by hand. So that's why I think it will have to be something where you just let the market and let the ones that know what to do with AI have access to what they need to be able to grow. But the key moment and the key, let's say, reality check is going to be now when we're going to design the new budget for the next cycle. As maybe people don't know, but actually 2025 is going to be a very important year in the political cycle of the EU, because that's when we start planning the next financial framework.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stake there. That's why you have had reports such as the Draghi report, such as the Enrico Letta report of last year, looking at the European competitiveness, because we are now trying to gather up and to look as clear-eyed as possible at what works well and what works less well in our single market, and try to see ahead as we're trying to plan for the budget and for the next 7-year financial framework. How do we best use the EU budget? How do we best connect the EU budget with the national realities and the national investments to make sure that you build an economy that actually serves our needs and our objectives for the next years? And that's no easy task. No easy task.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who want money. It's a tough economic climate. Interest rates are high, But this is, the future of European competitiveness. AI is foundational to the future of economic competitiveness, and getting it right really matters. Okay, this has been a fascinating conversation. There's one question I do have to ask you. We've been talking about the EU AI office. There's been some speculation in the press that you, now having left the parliament and having previously served in a role in the European Union Commission, might potentially have some kind of future role in the AI office. Is there anything that you can share with us on that score?
Unfortunately, I cannot.
Okay. Well,
there's nothing I can share. It's true that one of the options that I'm considering is to go back to the Commission. I don't know in which capacity. I have had many incarnations in the Commission before.
Yep.
So I'll see what the next steps will be, but there's nothing I can share publicly right now.
Understood. Well, whatever you end up doing, I'm sure you'll continue to be a leader on AI policy issues in Europe and around the world. I'm certainly grateful for the willingness that you've had to sort of share your insights, not just with me at CSIS, but also your willingness to engage across the transatlantic relationship and even around the world with, G7 member countries and so on. So, Dragoș Tudorache, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We'd also love to hear from you, so reach out to aipolicypodcast@csis.org with your suggestions and feedback. And finally, don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for our latest research reports and events. This podcast was produced by David Lutfi, Isaac Goldson, Sadie McCullough, Teddy Foley, Sam Gonzalez, and Irina Petrick. See you next time.